Welcome to the Clear Ground Show. I'm your host, Dr. G, with a PhD. Before we get started, remember guys, tell your friends about this show, and please like and subscribe on this episode. It really helps with the YouTube algorithms. If you like the thumbnail art, you can check it out on a much higher resolution on Instagram. And remember, leave any questions you might have throughout the week. And on the last episode of the week, I will be answering the questions in a mailbag. In the immortal words of Twisted Sister, we're not going to take it. Oh no, we ain't going to take it. We're not going to take it anymore. That is going to be the main underlying theme for today's show. We got a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about Canada truckers finally getting to Ottawa. Is Justin Trudeau in hiding? Truckers around the world are mobilizing after being inspired by this Canadian drive. Austria is looking at tightening its grip on other vaccinations. We'll take a look at a myocarditis study published in JAMA on January 25th. Sweden says absolutely not to vaccinating kids between the ages of 5 and 12. Chuck Todd questions Dr. Fauci on CDC's credibility. The Morning Consult has crazy polls on COVID, and we can check out how the nation's feeling. Moderna begins human trials on the HIV vaccine. And finally, the mailbag. So with all that, let's get to it. The Freedom Convoy began arriving in Ottawa on Friday. Let's take a look at them raising the Canada flag right here. A beautiful sight. Congratulations, Freedom Convoy. I mean, I think they're going to be coming in all weekend and maybe into early next week. The thing was 50 kilometers to 70 kilometers long, which is just incredible. But don't forget, guys, it's just a fringe, small group of people who don't represent at all the Canadians at large. Yeah, keep that in mind. Those were Justin Trudeau's words earlier last week. Now, in order to keep this small, fringe group of nobodies from really causing a ruckus, Ottawa closed down one of their main bridges into the city. That bridge was the Macdonald-Cartier Bridge, and the reason they closed it was that it has a load restriction applied to all types of vehicles. So out of an abundance of caution and safety due to a planned protest taking place this weekend in Ottawa, Public Services and Procurement in Canada wishes to advise motorists that there will be lane closures on the bridge until further notice starting Friday, January 28th at 8 p.m. Wow, who could have seen this coming? Speaking of Trudeau, he has mysteriously gone missing with his family into an undisclosed hiding location. From this small fringe group, guys. It's just a small fringe group. Now, look at this headline from the Times in Canada, kind of covering for Trudeau. It says, Trudeau is forced into hiding as the Freedom Convoy of anti-vax truckers rolls into town. Now, I couldn't agree more with the lady holding the sign in the picture. It's great stuff. Again, what should a leader do? A leader would confront this group, discuss, see what they want, see what they need, see what they've been saying this whole time, instead of, for the last, year or two, Trudeau's just been sidelining anyone that disagrees with him, and by using the words the science, just castigating them out into the darkness. So, I mean, this has been a long time coming. Now, what's important is that these truckers and all the people protesting, because, I mean, if you've been watching the screen, it's just hundreds and thousands of people are just lining the streets of Ottawa. Everyone needs to be peaceful. They need to make their voices heard. It cannot get violent. That will ruin any chance of getting the message across. So I'm supporting these truckers. I think a lot of people are supporting these truckers. And not just me and a lot of people in the US, but truckers around the world are mobilizing after being inspired by Canada's 50 to 70 kilometer long convoy, Freedom Convoy. From truckers in the Netherlands to truckers in Italy, even truckers in Australia are beginning to mobilize and head through the towns and streets of these countries. So it's an amazing thing looking at the lifeline of countries. You know, truckers and trains, these are the people that get your supplies to your doorstep or to your grocery store. And they're the lifeblood of many civilizations right now. And so they're standing up for what they believe in, and their voices are going to be heard. And I think this is going to finally get the conversation to where it has to be, to a critical point. And people are going to have to start making decisions. So I support these truckers. It has to stay peaceful. But this is some really good stuff. As per usual, not everyone agrees on everything, and countries around the world have a disagreeing view with these truckers. One of these countries is Austria, and we've been following them on the show for a little while now. But Austria, it seems like, is signaling further vaccination requirements, not just for COVID, but for other things. This article comes from Profil, and it's Drummel starts signaling for further vaccination requirements. Chair of the Bioethics Commission, Christian Drummel, considers further vaccinations against measles, whooping cough, or influenza are conceivable. And this was written by Clemens Newhold. In an interview, the head of the Bioethics Commission, Christian Drummel, says that, quote, the COVID-19 vaccination requirements could be the starting signal for a new attempt to better protect people against unnecessary diseases such as measles, whooping cough, or influenza, also by means of vaccination requirements, end quote. Regarding the flu, she says, quote, there is definitely a social interest in avoiding unnecessary flu outbreaks, end quote. In this context, she recalls the combination vaccines against COVID-19 and influenza, which the pharmaceutical industry is already working on. In the case of measles, the chairperson of the ethics committee based in the federal chancellery refers to the existing compulsory vaccination in Germany. Visiting schools and kindergartens is linked to the vaccination. The spread of measles was severely restricted by wearing a mask, says Drummel. However, that could change quickly because many vaccinations against other diseases, such as measles, were omitted during the pandemic. Drummel had already spoken out in favor of compulsory COVID-19 vaccination 1.5 years ago. However, she would have preferred a group-specific vaccination requirement for staff in hospitals, retirement homes, schools, physical services, and people over 55 years of age to a general vaccination requirement. Drummel said, quote, that would have saved a lot of effort, emotion, and polarization, end quote. Now, vaccines against measles and pertussis are already required in the U.S. for many schools, for kids to attend those schools. The issue, again, as has always been the case, is the conflation between the measles vaccine or the pertussis vaccine and the COVID vaccine. Two totally different monsters. Let's move on to this myocarditis study published in JAMA last week. As per usual, all links to everything I use in the show is in the descriptions. So if you guys want to read the full paper, it's there, and I think it's pretty interesting. So you guys should go check it out. I'm just going to briefly go over it. I'm going to show the title, a result, and one figure, and then move on. So the title of this paper was Myocarditis Cases Reported After mRNA-Based COVID-19 Vaccination in the U.S. from December 2020 to August 2021. So here's a brief summary of the results. Among 192,405,448 persons receiving a total of 354,100,845 mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines during the study period, there were 1,991 reports of myocarditis to VAERS, and 1,626 of these reports met the case definition of myocarditis. Of those with myocarditis, the median age was 21 years, and the median time to symptom onset was 2 days. Males comprised 82% of the myocarditis cases for whom sex was reported. The crude reporting rate for cases of myocarditis within 7 days after COVID-19 vaccination exceeded the expected rates of myocarditis across multiple age and sex strata. The rates of myocarditis were highest after the second vaccination dose in adolescent males aged 12 to 15 years, and that was 70.7 per million dose of the Pfizer vaccine. In adolescent males aged 16 to 17 years, it was 105.9 per million in doses of the Pfizer vaccine. And in young men aged 18 to 24 years, it was 52.4 and 56.3 per million doses of the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, respectively. There were 826 cases of myocarditis among those younger than 30 years of age who had detailed clinical information available. Of these cases, 792 of the 809, which is 98%, had elevated troponin levels. 569 of the 74, 72%, had abnormal electrocardiogram results, and 223 of the 312 had abnormal cardiac magnetic resonance imaging results. Approximately 96% of the persons were hospitalized, and 87% of these had resolution of presenting symptoms by hospital discharge. The most common treatment was non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. On their conclusion, based on passive surveillance reporting in the U.S., the risk of myocarditis after receiving mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines was increased across multiple age and sex strata and was highest after the second vaccination dose in adolescent males and young men. This risk should be considered in the context of the benefits of COVID-19 vaccination. Here's one of the figures in the paper, and this figure just shows the age at onset of myocarditis, and that's on the x-axis, so it goes from 12 to 40, and then on the y-axis it shows the reported cases of myocarditis after vaccination with the Pfizer shot, and then it shows it with the Moderna shot on the right. The blue, the darker blue, is the first dose, and the lighter blue is the second dose. And as you can see, basically between the ages of 12 and 30, that's where you have the huge hill. So lots of younger kids are getting this myocarditis. What's also interesting, and this was according to the Israeli National News, that it was the incidence of myocarditis in this age group was 133 times the background rate of myocarditis in the U.S. And these were based on CDC numbers. So now I think the CDC is actually doing they're doing monitoring and seeing which adolescents are presenting with myocarditis. and hopefully they give us that data. I mean, they've been slow on the wheel to do it, but maybe it'll get done faster. Who knows? Dovetailing perfectly with those findings, Sweden, this is according to Reuters, by the way, Sweden decides against recommending COVID vaccines for kids aged 5 to 11. And that was actually amended to 5 to 12, according to Stockholm on January 27th. Sweden has decided against recommending COVID vaccines for kids aged 5 to 12, the health agency said on Thursday, arguing that the benefits did not outweigh the risks. That's funny. Where have we heard that before? With the knowledge we have today, with a low risk for serious disease for kids, we don't see any clear benefit with vaccinating them, health agency official Britta Bjorkholm told a news conference. So great news out of Sweden. In light of the last few weeks of just bomb drops of information, the credibility for the CDC and NIH and Dr. Fauci have just plummeted. And this was to be expected for anybody following this stuff. This was coming. It was inevitable. But it's gotten to the point, it's gotten so bad that Chris Todd from MSNBC, who is, a Fauci fanboy, is even questioning him on the credibility of the CDC. Let's take a listen.
I think the hardest thing to watch has been the CDC here, Dr. Fauci, because, I'm going to be a little trite here. If you watch the movies about pandemics, the CDC is sort of the epicenter of things, and in many ways, but and maybe it was just that first faulty test sort of, it was hard to pull back. But ultimately, is that where the focus should be? Restoring confidence in the CDC, that has to be the place that the public, number one, believes?
The answer is yes. I mean, traditionally, the CDC has been, and still is, quite frankly, despite all the knocks that they're getting, that the CDC has been and is the premier public health organization in the world. And Dr. Walensky is absolutely committed to restoring confidence in the CDC and to get a much clearer, more crisp and consistent messaging. And I believe she is going to be successful. And I support her very, very heavily on that.
This dude is so toast. I mean, this is amazing. So part of the reason why their messaging is so bad is because they've been lying, or they've been, at least not they in the broad sense, but there has been so many misinformed statements coming out that we've acted on, that the only way that is going to be corrected is for them to start really truth bombing and them to just admit their fault. There's going to be a big mea culpa before any of this happens. And by the way, this was all self-inflicted, okay? It didn't start with Walensky. Dr. Redfield from the last administration has some of this on his hands, but Walensky and Fauci have really, really made this just insufferable. And so, yeah, the reckoning is coming, and this is going to be hard times for the CDC and I think the medical industry in general, as the public reels and recovers from this. Speaking of public trust in all these institutions, let's take a look at some morning consult polls. So the sort of field of these polls is titled The Return to Normal, and it's the views in the pandemic. And all of these were edited and created by Gavin Galvin and Matt Bracken. This was last updated January 26th, and here are some few key trends that they point out before we go into the polls. Falling support for vaccine requirements from employers and businesses. The public support for COVID-19 vaccine mandates from employers and businesses has ticked down in the past 2 weeks, with just over 1 in 2 adults now backing such requirements. Public just as concerned about Delta as Omicron. Adults are equally likely to say they are concerned about the Delta and Omicron variants. Despite Omicron's dominance in the United States, vaccinated adults are more than 20 percentage points likelier than those who are unvaccinated to say they are worried about either variant. And finally, 3 in 10 view the coronavirus as a severe risk locally. The share of adults who say COVID-19 is a severe local health risk fell to 31% amid a 6-point drop among Democrats, 40% of whom now say COVID-19 is a severe risk locally. As we've been discussing on this show since its inception on YouTube, the primary dividing factor in this, I think you're going to see, is politics. It's not the science, but let's dive in. This first chart shows concern over the Delta and Omicron variants, and it's the share of vaccinated and unvaccinated U.S. adults who say they are, quote, very or somewhat concerned about the Delta and Omicron variants. As you can see, vaccinated adults are the most concerned, with unvaccinated adults being the least concerned. This next poll is the COVID-19 vaccination requirements. The share of U.S. adults who say the following entities should require COVID-19 vaccination for employees, residents, or patrons. They have the federal government, state governments, local governments, employers, schools, and businesses. And almost all of them are dropping towards the more recent time on the graph. Next up, we've got tracking concerns over COVID-19 based on generation. And this is the share of U.S. adults who are very concerned about coronavirus outbreak by generation. And as you can see, in April of 2020, it's a huge spike from like less than 40% all the way up to past 60% for most generations. But as we get to the most recent days in January 2022, again, almost all of them are below the 50% mark. This graph displays viewing COVID-19 as a severe health risk in your community. This is the share of U.S. adults who say the coronavirus is a severe health risk in their local communities. Republicans are the lowest, and they've been the lowest throughout the pandemic. So right now they're in between 20 and 30%. And Democrats are the highest, and they've been the highest throughout the pandemic. And right now they are sitting at just at 40%. This figure details the economic versus public health impacts of COVID-19. This is the share of U.S. adults who say that they are more concerned about the economic impacts of coronavirus outbreak than the public health impacts. You can see that Republicans are the most concerned about the economic impacts. Right now, it's at over 60%. The Democrats are the least concerned about economic impact. Right now, somewhere between 20 and 40%, looking close to 30%, with independents and all voters right in the middle. This graph shows voter trust in congressional handling of COVID-19. This is the share of voters who trust the following more to handle the coronavirus. So Democrats in Congress versus Republicans in Congress, and the vast majority of the voter share decided that Democrats in Congress were to be more trusted than Republicans, and that has been the case throughout the pandemic and is still the case right now, although the line is trending downward. This chart shows Biden's net approval for handling COVID-19, and net approval is the approval minus disapproval, and that's among registered voters of Biden's handling of the coronavirus. So Democrats are up near 100. Well, I guess actually right now they're at like 75. Republicans are in the negatives. They're at negative 75, it looks like, with all voters and independents kind of right in the middle, both of which are below zero, but looks like they're trending up towards zero. This final graph shows net approval for leaders handling of coronavirus. The net approval is again the approval minus the disapproval, and that's among registered voters of each of the following handling coronavirus. So you have President Biden, which we already discussed, and he's down below zero right now. The CDC, look at the CDC. They were almost at 75% approved towards the beginning of this thing, and now they're below 25, probably like 20 or 19. You look at Vice President Harris, she started around 25, and she's now floating in the 10s, it looks like. President Trump, so this is going to be the first half of the graph because he's not president anymore, and his were in the negatives, except for in the beginning. So even after the vaccine was developed, he was still in the negatives and pulling down. Same with Vice President Pence. Then you have Congress. U.S. Congress was kind of in the middle at zero in the beginning. Then they dipped way below. They were in the minus 25 range, way below Trump. Then they're back up at zero in the middle, and now they're again close to the minus 25 range. Again, this morning consult is in the links. If you guys want to check out all these graphs, they're really telling and really informative. And it's a great way to see public perception. So go check them out. In our last story before mailbag, Moderna's HIV vaccine has officially begun human trials. And this is by Samantha Riedel, and it came out January 28th, 2022 in Them. Human candidates recruited for clinical trials last August received the study's first shot on Thursday at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. The vaccine builds on technology developed by Moderna during their COVID-19 vaccine production, with the goal of using mRNA to boost HIV immunogens and prevent the virus from disabling B cells, which are essential to fighting disease. Although medicines like PrEP and antiretroviral therapy, ARTs, have proved somewhat effective in slowing the spread of HIV and reducing its mortality, the virus is still a threat to global health nearly 40 years after it was first identified. Scientists hope to conclude human trials next year in 2023, coinciding with HIV's grim 40th anniversary. And now on to the mailbag. Our first question comes from D-Money. I think this graph makes sense when you consider that those least worried about COVID-19 are least likely to be vaccinated. Like someone that doesn't wear seatbelts is probably not concerned about getting in a car crash. What type of restrictions or mandates would you consider reasonable for COVID-19? Thank you so much for the question, D-Money. So from the very beginning of COVID-19, all the way back in March of 2020 and February of 2020, I did not think lockdowns were the right move, and I was very against a lot of restrictions. So the reason why was the data coming out of Italy and China at the time and Singapore showed that this was a very striated disease. We knew that it was targeting old people and immunocompromised people. But it wasn't really targeting young people. And I thought that lockdowns were going to be a lot worse in the long run than this virus would be. And we'll see if that comes to pass. The thing about COVID is that it's so transmissible. It's like the flu. How many restrictions do we have on any given flu year? I mean, not that many. People go to work, people go to school. They get sick. When you get sick, you stay home, not because anyone's forcing you to. One, because you probably feel pretty crummy and you just want to get better. But two, you might not want to infect your friends, and so you'll isolate yourself. And that's been kind of how we've dealt with a lot of these extremely communicable diseases. And I think that would have been the same with COVID. Now, we would have still seen, I think, pretty, a big spike in sickness and severe illness in the populations that we already see them in. But I don't see any evidence that restrictions did much to curb that. In the same vein, actually in March of 2020, I was a big advocate of diverting resources to the most vulnerable, to the elderly. We knew the elderly were going to get slammed by this thing. And had we diverted, I think, resources to, medicines, to healthcare, to things like that immediately to resolve this issue, then they could have gotten the treatment when they needed it, as fast as possible, timely. The interventions would have been a lot crisper because we were selecting the people who were really getting sick from this thing. I think that targeted kind of approach would have been really good as a healthcare response. But again, it's not a mandate or a restriction. I also think a lot of companies could have made the decisions for themselves. If they saw that, whoa, this is getting out of hand in our business, in order to protect our employees, we'll have them work from home. I think that decision could have been made instead of being forced to be made. And we'll see. There's so many things that went up in the air with the restrictions, and now how we're coming down from it. I don't know where it's going to fall, but yeah, generally speaking, I can't think of many restrictions I would actually have placed on the country if I was the leader. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you guys for another great week. Looking forward to giving you guys more news next week. And with that, have a great Sunday and enjoy this video. See you guys next week.
Love you, Mr. Bubs. Do you love me too? No? Oh, no. I think he loves me.
Yeah, I got you. I got this on camera.